The humid air of Vietnam clung to everything. The dense jungle, the narrow rice paddies, and the worn wooden homes that dotted the countryside. In the village of Hoa Binh, children ran barefoot through fields, laughing as they kicked up red dust. Farmers bent over their rice paddies, eyes fixed on the soil, unaware that forces far beyond their small world were already shaping their fate. The winds of change had begun to stir, and soon they would blow through every corner of this divided land. At the center of the storm stood Ho Chi Minh, a man of quiet determination. He had spent decades learning from the world, absorbing revolutionary ideas from France, China, and the Soviet Union. Returning to Vietnam in 1941, he became the face of a movement seeking independence from French colonial rule. For Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, the struggle was not merely political, it was deeply personal. Every village liberated, every French outpost seized, was a step toward reclaiming a nation long denied its freedom. Yet, across the ocean, America watched cautiously. The world had recently emerged from the devastation of World War II, and a new enemy had arisen: communism. To policymakers in Washington, D.C., Vietnam was a distant, almost abstract battleground in a global chess game. The fear was clear. If Vietnam fell to communism, other nations in Asia might follow. Thus, American advisors began trickling into South Vietnam, ostensibly to offer aid and guidance to the fledgling government, but in reality to sow the seeds of a far more direct involvement. Back in Saigon, the streets were alive with a fragile energy. Motorbikes zipped through traffic, street vendors shouted over the clatter of carts, and neon signs flickered in the warm night air. South Vietnam, officially led by No Dinh Diem, was attempting to consolidate power, but corruption and political repression were widespread. Many villagers whispered of instability and fear, uncertain who to trust. Meanwhile, the North, under Ho Chi Minh, quietly fortified its position, training soldiers and organizing resistance. In a small village near the Mekong Delta, Lan, a young girl of 10, watched soldiers march past her home, rifles slung over their shoulders. Her father, a humble farmer, tried to reassure her, but the worry in his eyes betrayed him. Villages like hers were caught in a dangerous limbo, too remote to be fully controlled, yet too strategic to be ignored. Every day brought rumors of skirmishes, disappearances, or sudden bombings. Innocent civilians were slowly becoming collateral in a war that had not yet fully erupted. The tension escalated quietly at first, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. In Washington, advisors wrote reports filled with optimistic language. The South Vietnamese can hold the line, or Viet Minh influence is localized. But reality on the ground told a different story. The North Vietnamese army was disciplined, organized, and ideologically driven. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks made every inch of territory contested. For the ordinary soldier, and for civilians like Lan's family, life had become a daily gamble with fate. Even as the North and South maneuvered, cultural life persisted in odd, fragile ways. Festivals continued, lanterns lit the night sky, and markets thrived. But these moments of joy carried an undercurrent of unease. Soldiers trained by day and patrolled by night. Villagers whispered rumors of spies in their midst. Children learned early how to stay quiet when strangers approached. Every ordinary activity, from fishing along the river to tending the rice fields, was shadowed by the invisible presence of war. Across the seas, America's involvement was slowly escalating. Military advisors like Edward Lansdale arrived in Saigon with briefcases and blueprints, offering counsel on counterinsurgency. They carried with them the belief that Vietnam could be contained through a combination of strategic planning and technological superiority. Yet even the most sophisticated maps and strategies could not account for the unpredictability of guerrilla warfare or the complexity of Vietnamese society. The advisors were outsiders, navigating a world that was foreign in language, culture, and landscape. Amidst this growing tension, the Vietnamese people continued their lives with quiet resilience. Villagers like Land's family adapted, hiding weapons under rice barns, burying messages in secret, and learning which roads to avoid. The North and South both claimed moral authority, yet the consequences of their ideological struggle fell on ordinary people. No one was untouched. Children grew up with fear as a constant companion. Farmers measured success not in bountiful harvests, but in days survived. By the early 1960s, the stage was fully set for a conflict that would soon engulf the nation. Political assassinations, coups, and protests punctuated the fragile peace. The United States, now under President John F. Kennedy, increased aid, sent more advisors, and began providing helicopters, armored vehicles, and military training to the South Vietnamese Army. Every decision made in the distant halls of Washington had repercussions in the villages, towns, and rice paddies of Vietnam. For Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, the goal remained simple yet profound: liberation. For the South, it was survival in a world increasingly dominated by superpower politics. And for civilians like Lan, survival itself was an act of courage. Each day brought a mixture of hope and terror, a delicate balance that could shatter in an instant. The storm clouds of war had gathered over Vietnam, unseen by much of the world, but felt deeply by those living under its shadow. The coming years would bring American soldiers, massive bombings, and battles whose names would echo in history: Dien Bien Phu, Da Nang, and eventually the jungles of the Mekong Delta. But before the first boots hit the ground in large numbers, the lives of ordinary people, farmers, children, soldiers, and villagers, were already intertwined with the larger forces shaping history. The rising storm had begun. The seeds of a conflict that would claim millions of lives, reshape American society, and leave scars still visible decades later, were planted. It was a war that no map could fully depict, no report could accurately predict, and no individual could fully understand. And as the sun set over the rice paddies, painting the sky in shades of blood red and gold, one truth became evident: Vietnam would never be the same again. The sound of helicopters sliced through the humid Vietnamese sky, their rotors chopping the air like relentless blades. American soldiers disembark onto mud-slicked landing zones, boots sinking into wet earth, rifles clutched tightly, eyes scanning the dense jungle for movement. The war had escalated rapidly. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the United States had sent tens of thousands of troops, convinced that superior firepower and advanced technology could turn the tide. But Vietnam had other plans. The landscape itself seemed to fight against the intruders. Thick canopies of jungle concealed hidden traps, winding rivers masked enemy movements, and sweltering heat sapped strength and morale. Soldiers like Private James Harris, barely 20 years old, learned that in Vietnam, danger was not always visible. A sudden rustle of leaves could signal a deadly ambush. Every step was measured, every shadow feared. The Viet Cong moved like ghosts, striking and disappearing before the Americans could respond. Meanwhile, civilians endured horrors both subtle and catastrophic. Villages were often caught between opposing forces. Lan, now a teenager, had grown wary of strangers, her childhood innocence eroded by the constant hum of military activity. Families hid in small, improvised bunkers beneath the ground, listening to distant gunfire and the whine of incoming planes. Rice fields, once symbols of sustenance and life, were now battlegrounds, their waterlogged soils scarred by shells and shrapnel. The American perspective, however, was dominated by a sense of urgency and determination. Generals and advisors in Saigon believed that overwhelming force could break the insurgency. Helicopter gunships, napalm strikes, and massive artillery barrages became standard tactics. Yet, for every village secured, the enemy had already vanished into the jungle, leaving behind fear, destruction, and mounting frustration. Letters Sent Home from Soldiers describes the contrast sharply. Breathtaking beauty in the rivers and forests, alongside unspeakable suffering in bombed-out towns and bloodied villages. The Tet Offensive of 1968 marked a turning point, both strategically and psychologically. In a coordinated series of attacks, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces struck major cities across South Vietnam, including Saigon itself. The violence shocked American forces and civilians alike. Military analysts had predicted a relatively stable South Vietnam, yet Tet revealed the depth of the enemy's planning and resolve. Television screens in living rooms across the United States broadcast images of burning buildings, desperate civilians, and heavily armed insurgents, moments that would forever define public perception of the war. Amidst the chaos, acts of bravery and humanity persisted. Corporal Michael Nguyen, an American soldier of Vietnamese descent, risked his life to pull a wounded villager from the line of fire. Children, despite fear, continued to play amidst ruins, their laughter a fragile defiance of the surrounding violence. Stories of heroism, both military and civilian, emerged daily, offering glimpses of hope in a war defined by fear and uncertainty. The civilian toll was immense. Entire villages were displaced, forced to flee before advancing troops or bombings. Refugee camps overflowed, disease spread, and hunger became a daily reality. Yet the human spirit endured. Mothers whispered stories of resilience to their children, farmers replanted their paddies whenever possible, and communities found ways to survive despite the relentless demands of war. These stories, often overlooked in military reports, formed the emotional heart of the conflict. Back in the United States, the contrast between battlefield reality and public perception grew increasingly stark. Soldiers' letters described endless nights of ambushes, booby traps, and ambivalent villagers, while policymakers emphasized progress and winning hearts and minds. The media began to question official narratives. Graphic photographs and television coverage brought the brutality of war into homes nationwide, fueling debate, dissent, and a growing anti-war movement. College campuses erupted in protest. Parents and veterans demanded answers. Political leaders faced mounting pressure. For the soldiers on the ground, the Tet Offensive was both devastating and clarifying. Friendships were tested in moments of fear. Courage became the currency of survival. Private Harris recalled one harrowing night in a mangrove swamp near Hue, where enemy fire surrounded his unit, forcing him and his comrades to make split-second decisions that would determine life or death. The jungle seemed alive, an unforgiving opponent that consumed the unprepared. Every patrol, every engagement carried the weight of uncertainty. Amidst the fire and fear, the Viet Cong demonstrated strategic brilliance. They struck where the Americans least expected, blending seamlessly into civilian populations. Their resilience frustrated the U.S. military, forcing a re-evaluation of strategy. Helicopters, artillery, and airstrikes could destroy buildings, but they could not eliminate ideology or determination. The enemy's commitment became a psychological battle as much as a physical one, a reality American soldiers and leaders struggled to comprehend fully. By the end of 1968, the American public's confidence had begun to erode. The Tet Offensive shattered illusions of a quick, decisive victory. For the soldiers, it confirmed the immense challenges of fighting in a land where visibility, alliances, and geography were constantly shifting. For civilians like Lan and her family, survival had become the primary goal, with moments of joy and hope squeezed between bombs, ambushes, and patrols. These moments were fragile yet essential, reminding all involved that even in war, humanity endures. As 1968 drew to a close, the war had transformed. What began as a distant ideological struggle had become a visceral, bloody, and deeply personal conflict. America had sent thousands of troops, poured resources into a foreign land, and faced an enemy whose resolve rivaled their own. North Vietnam, meanwhile, had solidified its control and commitment, willing to endure unimaginable losses to achieve its goal of reunification. The inferno was fully underway. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike had come to understand that Vietnam would not bend to expectations or maps. Every step taken through the jungle, every negotiation in the halls of government, and every act of survival in the villages contributed to a story of struggle, courage, and enduring consequence. The stage was now set for the next phase, a war that would not only test military strategy, but also the very hearts and minds of everyone involved. Across the oceans, while the jungles of Vietnam smoldered under relentless fire, the streets of America erupted in their own kind of battle. Cities, once quiet on weekend mornings, now thrummed with protest. In Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Berkeley, young men and women carried signs, shouted chants, and demanded an end to a war that many had never fully understood but deeply feared. The Vietnam War had ceased to be a distant conflict. It had invaded the very heart of American life. On a college campus in California, Sarah Thompson, a 19-year-old student, walked alongside hundreds of peers chanting slogans, "Peace now, bring the boys home." Her voice grew hoarse, her fists ached from gripping banners, yet she pressed on. Each protest felt like a small stand against a war machine that seemed indifferent to the lives it consumed. Students argued with professors, police, and even their parents. Families fractured along ideological lines as fathers who had served in previous wars clashed with children who questioned the morality of America's newest fight. Meanwhile, back in Vietnam, American soldiers were beginning to feel the strain of a war that had no end in sight. Sergeant Daniel Harper, a veteran of multiple tours, wrote letters home describing the monotony and terror that defined his days. Jungle patrols, night ambushes, and the constant hum of helicopters became the rhythm of life. Yet it was not only the enemy that haunted them. Soldiers grappled with questions of morality, purpose, and the impact of their actions on the civilians around them. A single misstep, an airstrike, a patrol gone wrong, a misjudged engagement could devastate an entire village, leaving scars that would last lifetimes. The war was changing. Under President Richard Nixon, the United States began implementing Vietnamization, a policy designed to transfer combat responsibilities to the South Vietnamese Army while gradually withdrawing American troops. Soldiers like Sergeant Harper found themselves training local forces, passing on knowledge while navigating the challenge of trusting a new generation of fighters. The shift was fraught with tension. Some South Vietnamese soldiers were poorly equipped or hesitant to engage, while others displayed courage and ingenuity, determined to defend their homeland. Amid these operational changes, horrifying events underscored the brutality and complexity of the conflict. Reports of the My Lai massacre shocked the world when details leaked, revealing that hundreds of innocent civilians had been killed by U.S. forces. The revelations sent shockwaves through both Vietnam and the United States. For soldiers on the ground, it was a sobering reminder of the moral ambiguity of war. For the American public, it eroded trust in government and military leadership. In South Vietnam, villagers like Lan and her family struggled to navigate the chaos. They had grown accustomed to hiding during raids, scavenging for food, and praying that their homes would remain untouched. Yet the shifting allegiances and frequent clashes made even mundane decisions life or death choices. Her older brother, now a teenager, joined a local militia to protect their village, understanding the peril that came with resistance, but feeling powerless to stand aside. The war was no longer distant. It had become an omnipresent reality, shaping childhood, adulthood, and every decision in between. The home front mirrored the complexity of the battlefield abroad. Families received letters from soldiers filled with coded hope and veiled fear. They watched nightly news reports of bombings, ambushes, and troop movements, each story adding layers to the collective anxiety. Veterans returning home faced a paradox. They had fought bravely, endured unimaginable trauma, yet many were met with hostility or indifference. The public had grown divided, some blaming the government, others blaming the soldiers themselves. The reintegration of these men and women into civilian life became a silent struggle, one that would leave lasting scars on American society. Amid the turmoil, human moments persisted. Soldiers and civilians found brief reprieves in laughter, shared meals, and small acts of kindness. Corporal Michael Nguyen, a soldier of Vietnamese descent, would often help rebuild homes damaged by fighting, providing villagers with tools and hope. American soldiers, too, sometimes shared cigarettes and rations with children or assisted in transporting the injured to safety. These moments were fleeting, yet they underscored the humanity that endured even amidst relentless violence. The political stage in America shifted dramatically as the war continued. Nixon's policy of gradual withdrawal faced both support and opposition. Anti-war demonstrations grew larger, and the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 exposed government deception regarding the war's progress and intentions. Public opinion had shifted from cautious optimism to deep skepticism and anger. Protests sometimes turned violent. Police clashed with demonstrators, tear gas filled the streets, and the nation seemed on the brink of moral and social collapse. In Vietnam, the fighting was no less relentless. As American troops withdrew, the South Vietnamese army faced the full brunt of North Vietnamese offensives. Villagers like Lan had to decide whether to flee or remain, each choice carrying profound consequences. Entire neighborhoods were burned, schools destroyed, and livelihoods erased. The psychological toll was immense. Children who had grown up amidst the early stages of war now knew only the sounds of gunfire, helicopters, and the constant threat of violence. Amid this chaos, acts of courage emerged. Soldiers continued to protect civilians, villagers resisted tyranny, and ordinary individuals made choices that would define their lives forever. The war, despite its brutality, revealed the resilience of humanity, the capacity to endure, adapt, and sometimes even hope. By the end of this period, the war had changed both Vietnam and the United States irrevocably. Soldiers who had served abroad returned home physically intact but emotionally fractured. Families struggled to understand the experiences of loved ones they had never seen in combat. Protesters celebrated victories of awareness and reform, yet the cost of the war's exposure remained high. In South Vietnam, the South fought increasingly alone, struggling against a determined and well-organized North. The war was far from over, but the social, political, and emotional foundations of both nations had been shaken to their core. The fractured home front highlighted that the Vietnam War was not only fought in jungles and rice paddies, it was waged in hearts, minds, and communities thousands of miles away. The conflict had revealed the limits of military power, the complexities of ideology, and the human cost of politics. Ordinary individuals, soldiers, students, families, and villagers had all been drawn into a narrative larger than themselves, a story defined as much by personal courage and tragedy as by strategy and policy. By the end of this period, the stage was set for the war's final, most decisive years. The American withdrawal, the continuing struggle of the South Vietnamese army, and the inexorable advance of North Vietnamese forces would soon bring the conflict to a dramatic conclusion. The world watched, histories were written, and generations forever carried the lessons and scars of a war that had reshaped not only a nation, but the entire globe. The sun rose over Saigon in 1975, casting long shadows over a city teetering on the edge of collapse. For years, the world had watched from afar, but now the war's final act was unfolding in real time. Streets that once bustled with motorbikes, neon lights, and the chatter of street vendors were now filled with the sounds of panic. Sirens wailing, helicopters chopping the sky, and desperate cries for help. The North Vietnamese army was advancing relentlessly, and the South Vietnamese forces, stretched thin and exhausted, could no longer hold back the tide. Lan, now a young woman, clutched her younger siblings and fled through crowded streets. Her village had already fallen, and friends had vanished into the chaos. Every step was a gamble. Every intersection could be the last. In the city, Americans and South Vietnamese alike scrambled to evacuate. Helicopters lifted off from rooftops, carrying families and officials, while those left behind tried to bribe, barter, or plead for passage. The fall of Saigon was not just a military event, it was a human tragedy, a desperate scramble for survival, and a symbol of everything lost in a war that had lasted decades. For American soldiers and advisors, the withdrawal was bitter and chaotic. Lieutenant Colonel James Harris, who had spent years in Vietnam training South Vietnamese units, oversaw the evacuation of a small district. His heart ached as he watched families torn apart, friends left behind, and the city he had come to know descend into fear. Despite meticulous planning, there were no guarantees. Every helicopter lift, every convoy carried the weight of hope, loss, and guilt. The streets of Saigon became a scene of surreal chaos. People clung to vehicles, carried their belongings on foot, and shouted directions as military convoys tried to navigate clogged roads. Tanks rumbled past shattered buildings, while planes overhead dropped supplies and, at times, lethal bombs to clear enemy positions. Yet even amid destruction, acts of courage persisted. Civilians helped one another over barricades, soldiers shielded children from gunfire, and volunteers formed human chains to evacuate the wounded. Humanity persisted even in the darkest hour. In America, the end of U.S. involvement was met with a mixture of relief, shame, and confusion. Families of returning soldiers tried to process the trauma their loved ones had endured. Veterans arrived home physically intact, yet haunted by images that no one could erase. The screams of the wounded, the smoke rising over villages, the final cries of friends lost in combat. Anti-war activists reflected on decades of struggle, victories, and failures, knowing the war had changed the nation's psyche forever. Television images of helicopters lifting desperate refugees from rooftops became emblematic of a war that had cost millions of lives and shattered confidence in government. In Vietnam, the consequences were immediate and profound. The South Vietnamese government collapsed, and the North swiftly moved to reunify the country under communist rule. Villages were rebuilt slowly, if at all, and millions of refugees sought safety abroad. Families were reunited, but many remained separated. Children who had grown up amid gunfire faced a world scarred by decades of conflict. Cities and countrysides bore physical and psychological wounds that would take generations to heal. Yet, even amid devastation, resilience emerged. Lan, having survived the final evacuation, helped organize makeshift shelters for displaced families. Farmers replanted their fields, slowly restoring rice paddies and livelihoods. Former soldiers, both American and Vietnamese, tried to reconcile with a past that refused to fade. Stories of survival, courage, and solidarity became as important as stories of conflict, illustrating the complex humanity of a war that had tested every limit. The legacy of the Vietnam War extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. In the United States, it reshaped foreign policy, public trust, and culture. The Vietnam Syndrome influenced how American leaders approached conflicts abroad, instilling caution after the bitter experience of intervention and withdrawal. Veteran stories prompted reforms in mental health care, while anti-war activism laid the groundwork for civic engagement in the decades to come. Universities, media outlets, and historians began to critically examine every aspect of the war, from strategy to morality, ensuring that lessons would not be forgotten. In Vietnam, reunification brought new challenges. The country faced reconstruction amid political upheaval, economic sanctions, and the lingering trauma of decades-long conflict. Children who had grown up in bombed-out villages struggled to attend school. Families worked to reclaim farmland. Cities rebuilt infrastructure destroyed by decades of fighting. Yet the Vietnamese people persisted, cultivating not only their lands, but also a collective memory of resilience, resistance, and survival. The stories of those who had endured, like Land's family, became part of the national narrative, a testament to human endurance in the face of immense suffering. The psychological impact of the war was enduring. Soldiers on both sides carried memories of violence, loss, and moral dilemmas. Civilians bore the burden of displacement, grief, and reconstruction. Families were changed forever, communities fractured, and generations influenced by experiences that had defined their formative years. The Vietnam War, unlike previous conflicts, was not simply a battle of armies, it was a struggle for hearts, minds, and the very notion of humanity. Historians later reflected on the conflict as a turning point in global affairs. It challenged assumptions of military superiority, highlighted the limits of foreign intervention, and exposed the complexity of ideological struggles in local contexts. The war left indelible marks on culture, politics, and personal narratives. Films, books, and art emerged from its shadow, preserving stories of heroism, tragedy, and survival for generations who never experienced it firsthand. As the dust settled over Saigon and helicopters disappeared into the horizon, one truth remained clear. The Vietnam War had reshaped a generation. Its impact was felt not only on battlefields, but in homes, schools, and communities around the world. Millions of lives had been altered, millions more had been lost, yet humanity endured. The war story became a mosaic of courage, suffering, mistakes, and hope, a testament to both the fragility and resilience of human life in the face of history's relentless march. Even decades later, the echoes of the Vietnam War remain. Veterans recount memories of friends, battles, and choices that could never be undone. Families share stories of survival and loss. Historians and educators remind new generations of the consequences of ideology, intervention, and the costs of conflict. And across the lush rice paddies, rivers, and cities of Vietnam, life continues, shaped by the past but determined to move forward. The last hour had passed. The guns were silent, the soldiers gone, the helicopters vanished. But the Vietnam War, America's longest conflict, left an imprint that no map could capture, no document fully explain, and no generation ever forget. Its lessons, its tragedies, and its resilience remain, a mirror reflecting both the darkest and most courageous aspects of humanity.